Be the first to know what's new on TJC. Breaking news, award-winning movies, exciting documentaries, and original series. Sign up for our free bi-weekly email program guide at tjctv.com.
Welcome to the Salon. Coming up, why Jane is pushing a Jewish marriage agenda, the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, gun control in the wake of Sandy Hook, should Israel ban skinny models, and the continuing relevance of Les Miserables. It's all up for discussion at the Salon.
Hello, I'm Jane Eisner, editor-in-chief of The Forward and Forward.com. Welcome to the Salon.
And I'm Rachel Sklar, founder of Change the Ratio. Happy New Year, Jane.
Thank you, Rachel, and the same to you. We have an awesome group of women joining us today. Katie Orenstein, founder and CEO of the OpEd Project. Joe Miller, who's a staff writer for The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. And Meredith Goldstein, the advice columnist and entertainment reporter for the Boston Globe and author of a new novel, The Singles. Welcome to you all, ladies.
Thank you.
So I think we're going to start with a piece that I wrote recently for The Forward. And it's a bit provocative, I think. I put it out there.
That's what we're here for.
That's right. But all of us in the newsroom were thinking about what are the issues that we would like to see discussed in 2013. And I picked one that I've been ruminating about for quite a while, and that is what I see as the decline of marriage in the non-Orthodox Jewish world. And this isn't something that just yentas like me worry about, but in fact it's supported by a lot of data. By the time non-Orthodox Jewish women are 31, only half are married. By the time non-Orthodox Jewish men are 34, only half are married. And this has led to a decline in birth rate and all sorts of worries. So
I'm panicking.
So I'm just wondering, you know, I'm of a slightly different generation than you all, I think. Is this something that you are concerned about as well? Would you frame it in this way? Meredith, what do you think?
Well, keep in mind I'm an advice columnist, so
that's why I asked you.
My day is spent reading letters from people who have marital problems or relationship problems. So as much as I'd love to see more marriages, I also want to see more successful marriages. And I find that when people get married young, and I'm saying under 25, I'll define that as young, they're the people who write me letters. So I think there is sort of a balance between, you know, only focusing on work and not getting married until you're in your late 30s and prioritizing it in your early 20s and prioritizing having children so quickly, because, you know, increasing the divorce rate isn't necessarily the answer to, you know, to really supporting the institution of marriage.
Yeah, Katie.
Well, you know, when you think about the declining marriage rate in Judaism, you really have to think about, do you think of Judaism as a race? Is it biological, or do you think of it as a culture? If you think of it as biological and you're thinking about you want to increase the marriage rate to preserve or increase Judaism, then, well, first of all, how is that different in some ways from eugenics? I mean, are we actually going to try and just make people marry in order to preserve some biological identity? And we're also up against a paradox, which is really a paradox of liberalism, which is the more inclusive we are, the more assimilated we are, also the more we tend to potentially compromise unique identity. And the paradox is that anti-Semitism is actually one of the best ways to preserve that. There's no surer way of ensuring that Jews marry Jews than anti-Semitism.
Well, the other paradox of liberalism too is that, you know, as more of the messaging, which is the woman can do anything they want, pursue what they want, and, you know, go by their own time clock, that comes up against, you know, the realities of biology and conversations like this.
No, absolutely.
Well,
you know, my most common letters are from 20-somethings who got married too young, and then 39-year-old women who are saying, why didn't I prioritize this earlier? Because, you know, I was, you know, led to believe that feminism means that I have to only focus on one thing, and that's myself and my career.
Well, that's a dilemma for me personally. I mean, I am a staunch feminist. I believe that women and men should have the choices that to live lives that are fulfilling, lives in which they can perform some kind of service for whatever their communities are. And I, even though I've been married for a long time, very happily, and really believe in it as an institution and as frankly the best way to raise children. I do think that these values come into clash with each other, and that's the struggle. And yet, I got to tell you, for women my age, women with, say, children out of college, this is a constant concern. Either A, they're concerned that their children aren't even in serious relationships, or if they are, they're with non-Jews. I mean, I mentioned my little jokey way of saying this. It's like, this is the price to pay for assimilation. We got what we wanted. We want to be the people that are accepted in society. What do Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton have in common? Jewish sons-in-law.
So you know what's interesting? I come from a mixed family. Half of my family is WASP, and half of my family is Jewish and very liberal Jewish. And that half of my family is much more diverse, interracial, intermarried, interfaith, and then the WASP side. And the lesson I draw from that is that the idea of Judaism on that side of the family is not one that's defined by race, not one that's defined even necessarily by religion. I feel like it's a cultural identity.
And will it be around, do you think? In
well,
20 or 50 years?
I mean, I have a different way of seeing my Jewish part of my identity.
I think that's part of it too. But we have to be honest with ourselves. I mean, the birth rate for non-Orthodox Jewish families is about 1.3%.
Can I reassure you on
far
that?
Low, far beyond below replacement level. Yeah,
I can at least reassure you on that point. I really enjoyed your piece, and I could feel the anxiety in it, and I kind of feel a twinge the same way when I see like all my Jewish friends posting their Christmas tree pictures on Facebook, and. But before I was a comedy writer, I was a medievalist, and
wow,
because hilarious Jewish life in the Middle Ages. But studying the families in Rome, where the records are very good, because it was a continuous community. In the Renaissance, Jewish people in Rome tended to get married late 20s, and this was when life expectancy was much shorter, and have about 2 children. So Jews survived.
We're surviving. I mean, the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox marriage rate and birth rate is really high. What I'm worried about is liberal progressive Judaism surviving.
I have the solution.
What?
All of those Jewish doctors should just work on the fertility issue. Just like make it easier for me to have a baby a little bit later, and then everything is going to work out. Jewish doctors, you know what you have to do.
Yeah.
Can I just say, we might also be focusing on the wrong thing, because the other statistic is that the more educated you are, the later you marry and the fewer children you have.
Absolutely.
And that's actually a much more worrisome problem if you think 500 years into the future. In fact,
I'm just
I
thinking of
believe there was
Idiocracy now.
Yes, there was a movie based on that.
That was a hilarious opening.
But it is true. I mean,
these
to
are
some
not
degree,
only changes that are in the Jewish community. These are, society-wide in terms of, marriage rates declining and people having less children. That also has to do with access to birth control and women being able to plan their pregnancies and plan, how they raise a family and when. So I think it's, it's part of a greater evolution.
Absolutely. So let's move on to another really difficult topic.
I wanted to talk about this more and more and more.
I think we were really, all of us, just gripped by the tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut. Even though it's been some weeks since that happened, I know that it's still something that I think about a lot. And, it has brought up this question about what, if anything, the government should do to control guns, to control ammunition. And I know, Joe, that you've been involved in this. What are we to make of the reticence of those in Congress who don't even want to go back to what we once had, which was a ban on assault weapons?
A very watered-down ban on assault weapons, because they couldn't get the votes at the time to pass what they wanted, so it was, and the NRA can come back now and say it was very limited in its effectiveness, because at the time they had to put these loopholes in. It's a very limited number of weapons that were covered. There were loopholes in it that magazines made before 1994, high-capacity magazines, could still continue to be imported. So there were 25 million out there already. The number's gone up since then because they continue to be imported. So it had limited effectiveness because it was attacked and watered down in order to make it have limited effectiveness. And it was hard to pass at the time.
Right.
So one of the problems, I mean, obviously the NRA is the most powerful lobby we have. But one of the problems is that you can't make good policy without data. And there's been a war on the data from the gun lobby since the mid-1990s, ever since the studies came out showing that having a gun in the home actually reduced your safety, increased your chances of being killed by that gun by a factor of 7 or 11. And tracing 57% of guns used in crime to 1% of the gun dealers. So these studies came out. The industry and the NRA went wild and started shutting down the information in the studies. And now if you're going to, the CDC has an injury prevention wing, and they really can't study anything gun-related because through the appropriations process, their money gets taken away. And so anyone, a scientist in the field, knows that they don't propose anything about guns because they will not get funding. And so the number of people studying it has dropped off. You still get a few, even if you look at the Brady site, their studies are old, and that's why.
But you know, the thing about this is that and those of us who are engaged in this conversation, the conversation around data and the conversation around guns are actually, we're having a losing conversation because we're actually, earnestly arguing as if there was any doubt around the numbers, and the numbers are so clear. We know the impact. We know what's happened with the United States compared to Europe. We know that the most deadly tragedies, all of them, the mass murder, whether we're talking about Aurora, whether we're talking about what happened in Connecticut.
We know that guns kill people,
we know it's
as well as people killing people.
And we know what kinds of weapons.
But what we're not acknowledging is that really the gun control debate is actually a proxy conversation for another debate, which is do we or do we not trust our government?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's
absolutely
which is a very good point. It's based on paranoia.
And it's so interesting when the shooting in Connecticut happened, just to see what happened in my world of social media, that it was just so polarized, and the government does this or it does that, and there was no, it's just one of those topics where there's absolutely no conversation about what works. There's no, there's, just two sides sort of, this is irrational, this isn't irrational, we should be allowed this, we should be allowed that, and it's such a difficult topic, one that, I feel like in other countries they can actually discuss what works and
I mean,
here
this is a paradigm that repeats itself again and again.
Yeah.
You see this happening like over contraception and abortion and, on immigration, like there's just, again and again, there's a sense that the right wing, there is a lockdown and everybody's tiptoeing around because they're like, oh, it's gonna be a fight. You're like, there's no way, they're too powerful. They make it too difficult. And at what point are people just going to get fed up and say, like, enough?
Well, Michael Moore, recently, they were screening Bowling for Columbine on cable the other night, and he was live tweeting during it, and he said, I think this is the time. I think that what happened in Connecticut will be the catalyst. And I thought, how optimistic of him. I don't feel that way. And
I
of all
feel that
people, you do.
Oh, yeah, I feel that way. It is absolutely time. Obama is entering a second term. This is such a catalyst, and the wave of public sentiment, despite the fact that 100,000 new members have signed up to the NRA since Newtown, I think it's time. One of the refrains from 2012 that I keep hearing in my head, interestingly enough, was, I'm blanking on his name, but he wrote the Lyndon Johnson, Robert Caro. He wrote all the Lyndon Johnson biographies, and what Lyndon Johnson said about passing the Civil Rights Act when people said, oh, it's going to be so difficult. And he said, what's a presidency for then? Like, I imagine that phrase echoing in Obama's head.
I hope you're right.
It's going to happen.
Not a Johnson-style president.
Yeah.
He's not. He's definitely not. But that's, he does come from that school, which is like, what's a presidency for? I do think that.
I want to go back to what
we'll see.
Katie said, because I think it's so interesting. To that, it speaks to the idea that we aren't just talking about facts and statistics, and even sort of the public health imperative, which I think is to some degree the right way to frame this. It is culture. I mean, I'm just wondering, amongst yourselves, do you have guns, or do you know anybody that has a gun?
I have
I
no
certainly
guns.
know people who do. I don't, but I'm from the South, and I have lots of friends who have guns.
Do you feel like you understand that culture? And
To an extent, I would say, it's not something I understand in an empathetic way in my heart, but say hunting culture is something that I don't agree with at all. I'm vegetarian. I don't believe in killing for fun, but I respect that. I respect that that's a choice that people have and should have. I do, on a deep level, understand the cultural feeling in the South of being besieged, and it bypasses the frontal cortex and it's straight to the amygdala, and it's because they're still fighting the Civil War. And I don't think they love their guns as much as they hate people like us coming and telling them that their way of life is wrong.
Wow.
And I do
really
understand that. If I turn on, MSNBC and watch 3 minutes of Alex Wagner, I kind of feel like I want to keep my gun, But because we can be obnoxious and sneering and very dismissive of something that they hold precious.
I sort of feel the same way when I turn on Fox, right? It's like, where's Alex Wagner when you need her?
Right. Well, the way that we feel when Hannity is screaming in our face is kind of the way they feel when.
Well, that's part of the problem. I actually am a big fan. We should be watching some of that. I think it's important, if you are somebody who naturally watches The Daily Show, to flip to O'Reilly, which you do, by the way, to flip to O'Reilly, but I don't think that the average viewer does.
Don't
in fact,
do
not
it too
my
much.
Friends.
I really
But the reason that's so important is that we actually, over time, we're not living in the same cultures. We're not even living in the same nation. And what I mean is that we're operating on not just on a different set of assumptions and presumptions. We're operating with different information, and there's research around that. The way we store and remember information is not neutral. We collect information and remember information systematically that fits the worldview that we have, and we systematically forget or dismiss the information that doesn't. So over time, we buttress the worldview we already have, and we can no longer even have a conversation with someone we disagree with, which is why I think it's so important. And actually, I think you do this really well on The Daily Show. I just wonder if your viewers do it as well as you all do.
I think that's
which
a really
is
good
cross-pollinating and finding out what the other sides think.
That's
Or
a really
skewering
good point,
everyone.
But people get so upset whenever Jon does one of these things with Bill O'Reilly, and I think that the debates between Jon and Bill O'Reilly are fascinating.
They're wonderful.
And I loved being in the audience at the last one, and there were people behind me who were like college age kind of frat boys. They were clearly on the conservative side, but there were some points where they were cheering for Jon, like saying something they hadn't thought of before, and it reminds you that there really is more of a mix out there than the echo chambers that we live in, even on our Facebook groups.
I want to turn to another subject that I think also fits into this sort of cultural and linguistic divide. In just a few days, we're going to celebrate, if you can say that, the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, January 22nd.
I thought you were going to say Tu B'Shvat.
No, that might be more of a celebration, but
we'll have a combined party.
But certainly, you have this landmark court decision enshrining a woman's actually conditional right to have an abortion. It's not. I think one of the brilliant things about Roe v. Wade is that it actually creates a sort of sliding scale. Well, early on in a pregnancy, woman has more right. Later on, the fetus has more of a right, and I think that's how it should be. But it has been, of course, incredibly mischaracterized. And I think what's interesting is the way those who are against abortion rights have really been able to capitalize on through calling themselves pro-life, which is so much more potent and emotional than calling yourself pro-choice. So what are the folks who want to see reproduction rights continue? What are we to do with that?
Well, first of all, I think the language question is really important. And yes, pro-life is such a, who's against life? But I also think it's really important to understand that the battle that they've won on one level is largely a branding battle. Because actually our opinions, as you pointed out in your editorial, haven't changed that much. The slight majority of Americans believe that abortion should be legal under some circumstances. And actually that hasn't changed in 40 years. Yeah. So actually what's changed, the only thing that's changed is the branding on top of it. Not that I don't think that's important, particularly because it can affect legal decisions. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's clearly important because it has affected legal decisions and, regulations that start small in state legislatures, and then suddenly, you've got like South Dakota or wherever cutting off funding for Planned Parenthood and putting bans on abortion, even in the
they've played an ingenious game at the state level, applying hospital construction regulations to abortion providers so that they have to widen their hallways, and like, how do you go out and picket no wider hallways? You know, they can't afford it, they shut down.
Yeah, I agree. I think the branding issue is incredibly important, especially when you get into a generation of younger women. You know, I always think about the interns I surround myself with at work who take certain rights for granted. And the labels they give themselves might not be as strong, but they're not as exposed to some of the things we've been fighting for. And I've been fighting for them maybe not as long as others. So I do think that branding actually, and the education surrounding it, what it means to be pro-choice, whether you are pro-life, pro-choice, or what personhood, this is like its own movement now.
A single cell.
Yeah, a single cell. What am I fighting for? What does it mean? And what are the, you know, really what are the smaller issues that sometimes creep up on us?
Well, you know, when you one of the things about this, and it's also true in the gun control debate, is that, and it's true really in American politics today, is that we've squared everything off, one side against the other, as if there were only two sides, and also as if there were not common ground. And that's really a losing proposition for all of us. Mm-hmm. I mean, it means that we'll never be all win-win. And actually, if you look at historically arguments that have shifted the culture, changed people's minds on a massive scale, and there aren't really that many of them of huge historical, you know, consequence. The ones that do, they find some common ground and they make some case not to win an argument, but to change the frame. So they don't actually use, or they don't rely on, let's say, clever branding or even just, yes, it's never just a question of language alone. It's a question of finding common ground and empathy and respect.
I completely agree with you, but I have to say it's really dismaying because I used to write a lot about this issue. And there was this, for example, there was a group called Common Ground, the Search for Common Ground in Life and Choice. There were attempts to actually shift the conversation. Remember the phrase that Bill Clinton came up with, safe, right, legal, and rare. Yeah. So it wasn't like we want to protect anybody's right to have an abortion at any time. It was actually creating this climate where we understand that, particularly early on in pregnancies, women should have the right, which is, by the way, enshrined in Jewish law, too. And yet, I don't hear that talk anymore. I mean, it feels like it is just, the urgency of it has just disappeared. And I really find it dismaying. You know, tell me, am I wrong?
It's dismaying. For one side, it's become a right taken for granted because it's been around for a lot of people's whole life. And for the other side, it's become an apocalyptic cosmic battle because the evangelicals have aligned behind it. The evangelicals were not, it was a Catholic thing. The evangelicals at the time of Roe v. Wade, the Southern Baptist Convention backed it, approved it, thought that this was a good thing for general welfare and health of the mother, including mental emotional health, not just life-threatening. It only became an evangelical issue after the evangelicals got together when the IRS threatened to remove tax-exempt status from Bob Jones University because they were practicing discrimination. And they were on a conference call and it's like, well, as long as we're all together, what else can we do? And somebody said, abortion? And it became abortion. So, but if it's a cosmic fight of good and evil, it's very hard to find common ground.
But here's something interesting, because it's so easy to just duke it out and forget this. I actually think there's a lot of common ground. I think one piece of common ground is that we all care about, not every single human being, but let's just say our deep professed belief in we care about women, we care about health. We care about children and parenting in different ways.
Amazingly enough, those, I mean, I hear
but
you
let's
on those
just say there are
arguments,
certain things we
scan.
don't. Right, but let's just take a moment to consider that possibly we do all care about those things. And then there are certain things that possibly are on the agenda, or on the Republican agenda, let's just say, that actually I think most people, maybe not a huge majority, but they don't necessarily agree with. For example, one thing that is we don't all agree on, and more people want than not, is legal access to abortion in some cases. So there are areas of common ground that we could acknowledge, and then there are areas that we could just expose. Hey, there's not consensus on this at all.
I mean, I 100% agree with you. That has just not taken root, and it's sort of that you can superimpose that onto the gun debate and say, we can all agree that we love children and we think they should be safe in school. And how is that not the bedrock position that we're operating from? How somehow has protection of the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms that was imagined in a world like Uzi and crazy automatic machine guns, like how does that somehow become the thing that everybody's focused on, as opposed to like the basic right for safety and sanctity for children? I mean, I totally hear you, but
yeah.
But
trying
because
to play to that is not working.
You know, call me cynical, but I'm not altogether convinced that you know, there is that common ground, that we can make the assumption that we all care about women. And
I agree.
We certainly have heard from certainly extremists over the past few years, but I don't know that that sentiment is there. And
I don't think, but I feel like we shouldn't, if we would like to have an argument with the extremists, then we're going to have a very tiny argument.
And then the question is it just the extremists? I mean,
it's not just the extremists.
Yeah, when you get into, when I look at younger people and the way they treat one another and just what's out there in culture, and you know, I start to wonder, to what extent do we all love women? To what extent are these extremists just extremists? And I think there is a real misogynist.
The other
I think
big element of it, of course, is that, you know, unwanted pregnancies happen because of sex, and sex is a huge taboo, difficult, like subject, and violence is way easier to deal with in America than sex.
I think there are plenty of people, and not just in the extreme. I agree with you, who, you know, I care about women, but not sluts who can't keep their knees together.
Not sluts and not,
you know,
right. And
I forgot my aspirin today.
But there's a spectrum. But there's a spectrum with where you can have a conversation, where I would like to be part of the conversation. You know, a lot of this conversation, and even gets, in some weird way, it gets back to the question of assimilation in marriage, which is, how do we want to define ourselves? Do we want to define ourselves in this silo where everyone who's in that silo with us is acceptable to us, or do we want to live in the larger world? And how large is that world for us?
Well, so why don't we, if you don't mind, just switch for a minute to talk about something maybe a little bit less serious, although maybe it might be serious as well. I don't know if any of you have noticed that the Israeli government has actually set some rules about the weight of fashion models, and said that under a certain body mass index, BMI, that you're not allowed to have a fashion model so skinny. And I don't know, this kind of strikes me as approaching all sorts of crazy things, both about body image, but also about, you know, here we are talking about Roe v. Wade and wanting to keep government out of the lives of women in terms of the choices they make about their bodies, and yet we've got a government wanting to regulate weight?
Well, I think it's, you know, it's not so much about that as it is about, again, a public health thing, and like strong messaging about safety, and looking at data and seeing that images of super skinny models, you know, tend to give women a false impression of what their body should look like, and leads to, you know, high incidence of eating disorders amongst particularly young women that can be debilitating throughout life. Yeah. So I, from that perspective, it actually fits in the same category, which is, you know, government saying, like, how can I, you know, balance the rights of the people and the safety of the people?
I blame kashrut. I mean, if anybody micromanages food choices, it's Judaism.
Yes, that's true. We are good at that.
But you know, I appreciate both what you were just saying there, Rachel, about health, and I also really appreciate what you were saying, Jane, about, do we really want the government messing with or controlling women's bodies? But for me, I think there's also a strategic reason why things like this are not going to be effective, because it's essentially putting more thought and effort and more fuel into this idea that we're all about our bodies. And it reminds me, a few years back, I was asked to speak. National Organization of Women had a Love Your Body Day, and they asked me to come speak, and I said, only if I can say what I really think, which is, love your body, hate your body, who cares? Stop looking at your nasal. Get a job, get a cause, go out and say something, go out and do something, have a family. But if it's always about our body, then that's going to be a very small world. Love your mind. Yeah.
Yes, that's
I just
great.
can't imagine legislating something like this. I mean, especially in this country. Well, you know, at that point, do we move on from models to actresses? You must be this size, you must be this tall to ride the ride. And
but they do have rules around, and these are fairly recent rules surrounding, like, the age of models in runway shows, and, you know, and I guess the representation thereof.
And certainly, and I think, you know, in Israel, it is a culture where models are sort of the sort of top tier.
Top export.
Yes,
right,
yes.
whereas here we have reality stars of all different shapes and sizes, and that's not to say we don't have serious problems with body image in this country, but I'm not sure that would work here.
Aha. Okay, well, we can't end this program without Rachel, Les Mis. All right, Up or down? Who saw it? Who loved it? Who
I love that
I gave
it
it a
is,
thumbs
and I
up.
had some quibbles, but I actually do think, because we were laughing and talking about like how we're trying to, squeeze Les Mis into the conversation, but it actually fits unbelievably well in light of this conversation because
Okay. Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Well, first of all, the whole Fantine storyline about her losing her job because the foreman had the hots for her, because she had a child out of wedlock, and all of the ways in which this was terrible for her. And she had no other options but to be a prostitute. I mean, you don't see the kind of like terrible choice. And this is a sort of a operatic Victor Hugo novel from the 1800s, but it's still rooted in the realities, and the realities for women that. Pregnancy is a huge determinant, whether or not you have a kid, whether or not you're available as a sexual object. It's always been a huge determinant, and things would have been really different for Fantine if she had existed in this society and could have been able to watch a Salon and learn from it.
But actually in a lot of different ways. I mean, it's not just, okay, so whether or not you can choose to have a child, what other choices, like what kind of job opportunities are available to you? If you do have a child, what kinds of support are available to you? I mean, like a million different choices.
Whether the mayor will listen to you, whether you're distracted by Javert.
So here's what that makes me think, because we were having the conversation about, it's not just about Roe v. Wade, but earlier we were talking about the shift in the numbers in Congress. And also in my field, we've seen over the last 5 years a pretty significant improvement of women's representation in key opinion forums, which I think is really important because they drive thought leadership and policy and public policy and opinion and resources and talent at higher and higher levels. And the bottom line for me on that is that you need to have more women, because whoever is writing history, whether it's in the Washington Post, which calls itself the rough draft of history, or whether it's in Congress, which is writing or deciding the laws, whoever is in that position to write them is going to write the choices for all of us.
Well, maybe whoever was writing the next Les Mis would find somebody to play Javert who can sing. What do you think?
Yeah, to me, that's the most important issue.
That's right. Absolutely. Well, thank you all. This has been another wonderful and stimulating conversation of the Salon. I want to especially thank our guests, Katie Orenstein, Joe Miller, Meredith Goldstein. Rachel, it was delightful to be with you. We'll be watching those Oscar nominations and awards, won't we?
Anne Hathaway, I feel like she's going to take it.
Thank you. I'm Jane Eisner, editor of The Forward. Please continue the conversation on our Sisterhood blog. For everyone here at the Jewish Channel, thank you.
Thank you so much. Happy New Year.